Well, I've been thinking about writing. I've been thinking about writing as like an existential act. Because there's obviously like a proliferation of people writing and able to and an ability to share it online. Um, and I think this can be a great thing. I think this can also be a tricky thing to navigate because, like what are your motivations, et cetera, et cetera. And I do wonder if also it's unique to our modern moment that like because of the printing press and because we have like texts that we can read and we can respond to, and we have like, even though a pen is a simple technology, it's still a technology, so we can write, but now we have computers, you can type, da da da. So basically, there's different types of writing or like modes of writing, if you will. But I do wonder because I think like personally, there's definitely I think most people can well maybe a lot of people who maybe would be here at the net would like resonate with either one already having a writing practice or two feeling compelled to articulate certain things through writing. And I wonder, there's a part of me that kind of wonders like what's happening there, like why, what is that compelling feeling to write something? And then, if you write something, you're not writing another thing. So you like there are limitations that you are engaging with to do so. And then you also be making a claim because like why else are you writing? Now you might just be doing kind of more like descriptive prose or just sort of observing, or maybe it's fiction or whatever. But like there's always some sort of stake in there. Usually there's some sort of thing you're putting out. And yeah, so I guess I'm just like there's a part of me that feels it's inherent. Hey Seth, it's inherently I don't know if it's inherently one way or the other because it could go, obviously it could be ego driven and then it could be not such a good thing to necessarily do. But then I do think there's almost you almost have to counteract the ego in doing something that could look egoic that also could be a great thing about writing and the practice of writing. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, maybe contemplating the question can keep you in paralysis so that you just don't do the writing anyway. So that could be an issue. But yeah, it's also like I have found this, even since years ago, like I remember writing a poem called a Paper Jam. I think I called it something like that. And it was just about like, basically it was just the idea of, getting stuck. And then I thought, why don't I write a poem about, being stuck in what you want to say or what you want to write? But yeah, there's something that feels very existential about it. And also maybe it has to do with feeling seen or feeling heard or just the fact that you exist. But yeah, Seth, I'm contemplating the question about like, why do we feel compelled to write something? And maybe it's just a leap of faith to trust that intuitional feeling and just say, oh, I don't know why, and I'm just gonna do it. Um, but yeah, there's a lot I think that actually has to be addressed in oneself because you also have a lot of patterning about what it means to write or why you would write, or thinking about it in terms of assignments. So then you think, oh, it needs to be like this, or it needs to be like that, or there's just human slothfulness, right? Or laziness of like, oh, I don't want to keep doing this. So I think there's like a lot of things you would need to, yeah, again, work against, but for this, like, it's almost like resistance training and weight training, right? Like it's like that you can maybe develop yourself more through the act of writing. Um, but yeah, I don't know, it's just a question that comes to my mind. I also think the wordplay of write and write is very interesting to me because I do think there's something possibly about the act of writing that can possibly do reorientation for yourself or something like that, so that you can maybe write things like when you write it out, you sort of make it right or something like that. There's something like you make it right within yourself to orient yourself toward the thing that you're grappling with through the writing process. So yeah, maybe if you think of it more like exercise itself, I mean, I'm sure this has come up before in some conversations, but if you could just think about it like literally just an exercise, like and I've been thinking about this lately too. It's like, what deposits are you putting into your life? So even if it can just be a 15-minute chunk or 20-minute chunk of this or that or the other, if those things can energetically help you, do it and don't think about it. Don't worry about the fact that you're writing one thing versus another thing because you have 20 things you want to write about. So just do like a act of faith to do these sort of deposits within yourself that then can come forth as a potential good for others, and an offering not only to yourself but to those around you, because otherwise it kind of just lives in your head anyway. But then again, before writing was so normal, people did just like have stuff in their heads, but maybe they had less of a psychological, um, world going on because they had so many tasks. It's like we just gotta get water, we gotta go hunt, we gotta go do this. So, less space to think about all the questions and whatnot. Though I'm sure people did have very profound thoughts and very profound questions even then. And they maybe had that more through like oral tradition, right? Oral tradition, markings like engravings and other types of things that they didn't have, a pen or a laptop or a keyboard. So anyways, I'm just thinking about writing and how it can feel existential. And again, maybe part of it is just having to like put your pen to paper. It's like or whatever, fingers to the keyboard. And maybe there's also something there too, like dealing with different mediums. And again, a lot of it is how like, you could be like, well, I'm not really writing as fully in my expression because I'm not using my handwriting. I mean, these are the little thoughts that just come up for us as humans that can then make you say, oh, maybe I won't do that. Because I'm not doing it like the best or the right way, right? Versus just writing it so that you can make it right or whatever, to do on that wordplay. So I'm going to stop there, but I've been thinking about writing as an existential act and what it means for us today as moderns. And is there a way to think of it as like an inherently good exercise for us to be doing on a regular basis? And I do think like there's the space for journaling. I've seen that be beneficial. And then I also think the articulation of maybe more like analytical concepts or an essay or something or story, whatever, that also seems to have its own sort of place. But the two are probably very dialectical with each other. Like the journaling and then this like there's like, oh, there's like some articulation here that I want to draw out and then put in something else. Let me
No,
share.
absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. And Seth, absolutely divine to see you, sir. Thank you for coming, Mr. Luber. Your conversations at Friends of the Beautiful have been tremendous. So wonderful to see you both. I have just noticed that the second reminder email is now being bounced by Google because of this new email account. So it's just great where they decide to delete the DLGA. So we'll figure it out. But anyway, yeah, as you were speaking, I'm thinking increasingly, I know we had the conversation on the work of limits, contingent limit, actual limit, and excess limit. And more, I would like to argue that the social coordination mechanism is about the effective testing to determine excess limits, things like beauty, things like learning, without which the human doesn't do well, and that the pricing mechanism has been ineffective at recognizing excess limits because they are not intelligible to the system, because they are infinite, because they're qualitative. And actually, human beings, we have this problem now where technology, like I've been doing a lot, The End of Belonging Again 2.2, which is an example of a book that was finished 2 years ago, and then 700 pages later, it turns out it's not. It's a terrible habit, and then moving it around, but really got into this examination of what economists mean by productivity. Like, what do we talk about by productivity? And what's very, very interesting to me is how it's kind of mysterious to them, like what growth is and things like that. And without going through the entire argument, I would like to argue that basically productivity, which there's two ways you increase GDP. There's a zero-sum way and a non-zero sum way. You have increasing growth through productivity and then increasing growth through what I want to call creativity. Productivity is whenever what seems to be an actual limitation, such as the ability to fly, is unveiled to be a contingent limit because you invent technology to fly. So it was seemingly actual, like humans can't fly, and then it turned out it wasn't. So it was a contingent limit. And this is what technology does. Like, the productivity of technology is the gradual unveiling of what we think are actual limits to actually always already be contingent limits. And so they're not really limitations. And so then productivity goes up because now you can fly and all the benefits of that. And this would, you can apply this logic. Technology increases GDP by turning actual limits into contingent limits. But here's the issue. Human beings without limits suffer. Like, without limits, humans don't function. We don't do very well. If there are no limitations, if there's nothing we can overcome, we're actually destroyed by our psyches. So we require limits to function. But the very way that technology works is a elimination of limits, right? And you see, the problem that you have is the pricing mechanism is so effective at removing limits that it removes limits that we need for development faster than we can replace them with new limits. And also, they can't be arbitrary limits. And Mr. Rivera, good to see you. I've certainly enjoyed the Friends of the Beautiful conversations. So the idea is that you actually, what happens is we have a system now where technology is removing all limits, quote unquote, as contingent, which increases productivity and GDP, but removes what human subjects need in order to flourish and do well. So we need new limits. But then if you say, well, let's just get rid of modern technology to create limits, they're arbitrary, and it's like trying to replace givens. They don't work the same way. So you need new limits. Well, another limit that I would associate with lack, as Thomas Jockin describes it, is the limit of you can't look at the sun. Not because of an excess, right? It like overwhelms you, or beauty, it kind of overwhelms you, right? So there's an actual limit here, but it's a limit from excess, not from technological inability or say, I can't just randomly turn into a lizard, right? That's a kind of limit, but it's arbitrary, so it's not going to be creative. Although I do think thought ultimately autonomously longs to be like a dream and has to actually encounter otherness, limitation, and beauty in order to not suffer that auto-cannibalism. And so what you need are excess limits. And excess limits are things that you can never complete. And what's very interesting to me is when you're speaking about writing there, I almost feel like, and I've talked about the sacred romance, and I think we can connect this with beauty, we can connect this with question. The gentlemen were speaking about the question of kind of ethical activity, beauty versus shame, theme, and so on. We've spoken before about the sacred romance, and we spoke about it with, root and rhizome, how there's this weird sort of ability to basically work in a way where you're working on a poem, and that some reason pulls you out into a walk to look at the full moon, and that reminds you to call your sister, and there's this kind of string kind of pulling things, Aspasia, divine to see. Michelle was talking about why write, and now I'm talking a little bit about the sacred romance, which came up in our talk, Seth and Aspasia, and how there's this thing that kind of pulls you. And it's kind of interesting in writing on this question, like what makes one write can also be what makes one do Feldenkrais, what makes one go into ISTP, what makes one write a book on theme, what makes one like go into like ask questions. What is this thing pulling a human being into action that they feel like they ought to do, but it's very hard to explain why. You could tie this to the Bergsonian intuition, and basically what it would seem to be, because you're also asking this question, if there's something about today after the printing press, the internet, and so on and so forth, that basically then leads to an expansion of the internal state where writing seems more important. And Mr. Jockin, divine to see you, sir. Absolutely wonderful. I've certainly enjoyed the Friends of the Beautiful conversations, and great. Thank you for coming by today. Michelle was talking about why write, and I'm talking a little bit about the sacred romance, and I was talking a little bit about creativity, productivity. But the point I was getting at is if there is something in the human being, this intuition, that almost seems to lead an individual life in a mysterious way toward the excess limit that must be used to replace the loss of limits due to technology unveiling actual limits to be contingent limits. And we can't stop technology from doing that. And that's because that's productivity. But you replace that with excess limits, like writing, because you can always write more. You can say being a writer, but there's a quality of writing, right? And I think there's also a feeling that compels one to writing. And I want to argue that basically the ineffective coordination of the system for excess limits, and anyone can speak at any point, please. The ineffective coordination of excess limits is why the economy stagnates. You get growth hits growth plateaus because creativity is actually how you get non-zero sum growth versus zero sum growth that's concentrated. But creativity comes from subjects that are formed by following something that they intuit. And there's this feeling of unlocking something. Like, right? There's this feeling of if people did Feldenkrais, this would actually unlock something. Or I know when I'm writing, there's something I'm intuiting that I can't fully see, but you're writing in order to unlock it, to kind of make it come forth, right? And there's something about that motivation that also then is one of the reasons why you say, go to the coffee shop or do this job. There's a kind of high order through line through all of these things that it would seem that if the human being doesn't have, they don't really develop very well. And I think this is a form of limit, like an excess limit, and I think we can associate it with theme, as Mr. Luber would describe it, that actually becomes more pronounced in its need the more the internal space of the subject opens because of writing and reading. Like William Ong talks about how basically after the book, humans have a larger anterior space. Like he talks about in oral traditions, the feeling anger and the speaking of anger were two sides of the same coin, that there was not a pause, that the internal space, the pause actually develops from basically the printing press and reading. That actually creates a division between the internal state and the outer state. It could be argued that as subjects gain that, they actually perhaps also gain this mysterious intuition that actually, I think, ultimately guides them toward beauty. That's ultimately guiding them towards sanctification and development. And then the ethical can be thought of as the courage to actually follow that thread. Because like if you write, yeah, if you write a claim, then people can judge you. Like if you write something down, you can judge you. If you start a company doing Feldenkrais or ISTP or something, then people can judge. If you teach a class on something, then people can judge you, right? And it's scary to do that, right? Because then they think you're egotistical, that, you know, you think that you have something. Oh, who do you think you are, right? There are all these kind of judgments that occur, right? I think it is difficult to engage in kind of the fullness of the ethical life, quote unquote, unless you relinquish the image that people have of you, like give up control of how people see you, right? And that's very, very difficult. But that seems to be part of what is necessary for giving over to this kind of sacred romance. Because yes, there's something about, and then if we can speak about anything today, Michelle was just talking about writing, and I'm increasingly interested in this sacred romance, which I think gets at Eros and how actually we are structured in the Dante sense by Eros in this way. How there does seem to be increasingly a sense in people of this intuition. And it's just interesting how you can either deny that intuition or that thing pulling you along. I think we can associate this with authentic resonance, as we've spoken about with Seth and Aspasia, you know, that we've talked about a lot. Like that it is actually giving yourself over to this. And then the weird thing, there's also a way in which you have to figure out how to give yourself over to it. Like it's actually not self-evident. Like I know what to do to give myself over to being an engineer. I go to the courses, I do this. But if I want to give myself over to the sacred romance that pulls you towards sanctification and the beautiful and so on and so forth, there's a certain like having to figure that out and also writing to figure that out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this mystery, if you will, of the human experience is actually increasingly pronounced today. But I'll give it to you, Michelle, and then Mr. Luber. Michelle, please.
Yeah, just a quick comment. That was all very good. And I guess I was just thinking about how, yeah, what's funny is like I was saying with that poem I wrote about that's called Paper Jam, is like, it's funny that writing is it's a limit, right? But actually what makes it feel hard to proceed is because you have to make a choice. Like you have to do some things that kind of guide whatever it is you're writing, unless you're just doing like, you're just journaling in the morning or something like that, which has a great role too. But it's actually it's this interesting relationship between the limitlessness, which should feel wonderful and free, right? But then we can't handle it. So then we're like, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'll do. I don't know which I'll choose, right? But then when you do make a choice, okay, I'm going to just write about this particular topic because it's been on my brain and it's still on my brain. Then when you go to write about it, suddenly you're like, oh, like what comes forth, it's just so different. And I don't mean to harp on this, but it's so different from like, here's your outline, here's here's your intro paragraph, here's like how you're kind of taught to write in school. Because what really happens is like, it just goes places that you didn't even think you'd end up. And you have to kind of let it, because suddenly you're talking about this thing over here, and then you're talking about it from this perspective and this angle. And I love what you've said too, Daniel, about like orbiting. Like just keep orbiting the topic. Don't worry if there's, if this is an intro or whatever, just like orbit the thing. And that brings forth, that brings forth the very thing that's trying to come about. It's kind of like, it makes me think of like spiraling, and how spiraling, like, we've talked a lot about like no straight lines in nature, and spiraling is really important. Like the way the baby comes out of the body in birth is a spiral trajectory, which is really important for its imprintation of its its spine and its double S curve and its spine and neck. And it's really important. It's just the way that it's like the double helix of the DNA. Anyways, it's just really, the spiraling and the orbiting is really important. And the fact that you don't know, suddenly, you're talking about a topic, but it's not the way you thought it was going to go, is both a limit. Shows how there's a limit there, but it has this overflow. Because we talked about this a lot in the limit conversation. It's like the limit actually allows for this overflow of something, that comes because of the limit. Not in spite of it, but because of that limit. Suddenly you're like, whoa, I just didn't even know that it was gonna go this way or that way, and whatever. And yes, you have to kind of weave it back together, but there's something really amazing about that. And it does feel like a big faith process, like a big trust process. And that's important for us humans, I think, because even though it seems like, doesn't feel like facing a lion or something like that, there's a courage there, because it really is, as Aspasia was saying, it's like, it's a part of you. And that's why it feels so existential. It's you. putting yourself into something that you create and that comes forth from you. So yeah, I just wanted to say that really quick. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. And yeah, there is something about weirdly, again, in writing, because there's also a question of where does it come from? It's a weird combination of what you've thought, what you've read, what you've experienced. Like, what is your standard by which you determine what you write, or what compels your action? There is something about just the very actual asking yourself the question, what compels my action? Right? That then kind of opens up something to be figured out, that actually the very wrestling with that figuring out seems to do something to develop the subject that is increasingly necessary as technology increasingly makes it difficult to find essential limits, because technology is increasingly unveiling what seems to be actual limits to be contingent limits in order to increase productivity. And basically, without the social coordination mechanism, you will not get an effective coordination of new limits that are excessive, that have this ever deepening sacred romance quality to it, without which the human will not develop very well. There's a lot more to be said of that, but I will give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir, and I hope you're doing well. And as I was saying to the other gentleman, I've certainly enjoyed the Friends of the Beautiful conversation. They've been magnificent. Mr. Luber, I hope you're well.
Thanks, Daniel. Good to see you too. I'm outside on a quick walk. You were you were saying something that made me think, um, like intuition and inspiration come from, in my opinion, the same dimension of life, where um, maybe there could be an articulation where, when you're inspired, you might have like a more concrete image, if you will, versus intuition. It's maybe more of a, you get a feeling or a sense. I don't necessarily buy that articulation, but I could see someone making that distinction. But for the sake of argument, if they are essentially coming from the same dimension, I always wonder what, and this has to do with like the beautiful, the strike, the surprise. Does the strike, which I would say, well, where the strike is placed in relation to the intuition/inspiration is interesting, because I think there's a question where, does the strike of surprise need to come from something real, like something really happening to you, or can it come from a fiction? Can it come from something completely in your head? And like, obviously, like the the trickle down to that question is actually insane, because, like, just to lay out how I'm seeing the trickle effect here, when someone moves to war, for example, or when someone is surprised and realizes an enemy, does that does that necessarily need to be coming from a reality, or can it come from an abstraction from that reality, a fiction, if you will? And I think, the answer, so to speak, kind of determines whether, how to treat your enemy. Not only how to treat your enemy, but how to diagnose when it's actually something threatening or is an enemy. Like, I think that's more important. Like, so for me, like, this has to do with like woke culture, and to some extent, because when someone, let's just, you know, I'm going to paint a hypothetical where it's like, you got the classic woke person that gets offended by something, right? What and let's say we frame that offense as maybe not a surprise in the sense of like the beautiful, but let's say that offense is shocking to that individual. Um, them understanding the nature of the action that offended them, to what degree do they need to understand that nature for them to actually have an appropriate response, or rather an appropriate understanding in which they're able to say they're offended? So this, and I was talking about this with the Friends of the Beautiful. It's like the second you think you know the whole story, there's a certain lack of like humility actually, where it's like you're saying that you're like the authority on whether this is an offensive act or not. And there's not that humility in terms of questioning the situation in such a way where you actually don't have an answer, but you have a bunch of possibilities. And trying to understand those possibilities in itself doesn't give you a determination on whether the situation is offensive or not, or how you should feel about the or how like you should feel about the situation in a definitive way. But it makes you actually want to encounter the person that caused you to have all those possibilities, like I'm trying to think how to tie what I'm saying together here, but essentially it's how do we with intuition, with writing, like tying it back to that, it's the same thing. How do we approach when we have a surprise, something startles us or something upsets us or something makes us happy? How do we respond to that in a way where we don't make a definitive determination on what caused that initial response? That way you have the humility to not make a determination, and you're able to kind of navigate it as if it's an open-ended story and there's a mystery, instead of just like labeling the person as like bad, they're fucked, they're fucking out of their mind or whatever. Like I'm going through that right now. Like my best friend, who's had 2 complete manic episodes, he's diagnosed with bipolar schizophrenia. He seems to be having another episode right now where he's just blowing my phone up completely. It's like, how do I, like, obviously there's something wrong, but like, how do I not just put him in a box where it's like he's ill, let me write him off, and like let me turn my back on him, and it's a done deal, because there's something not right about that, despite there being like obvious issues with the person. But at the same time, like, it's hard for me to not turn away from it and be open-minded and seeing the mystery of what's really going on, because it really feels like, from my perspective, that I have the entire situation, like I understand the situation, and I am labeling him as crazy manic, and I'm writing him off, and that's it, and case closed. How do I see that what he's doing is there's more to the story here, there's mystery, let me try to understand, let me think about different possibilities of what's happening and what could be causing this behavior? It's very hard for me to do that right now, and yet I feel like that is the right way to be, because tying it back to writing, in my experience, every time I turn and I'm like, yeah, this is it, this is right, it's going to cause such a big fucking rewrite, where it's basically a page 1 rewrite. And it's like, clearly that wasn't the right orientation to have when dealing with that inspiration of direction with the writing. And the analogy here is, when a person does something that causes an inspiration, a direction, a way for you to demarcate and make a determination on the situation, and you move forward. Like, that's the analogy. Because every time you do that, you kind of get bit in the butt in some way. And like, like you can, I don't know I don't want you to get flagged on YouTube, but basically it's like, for example, in like LA, it's like the R word, right? I don't know if you could say that on YouTube. I just got flagged on my RFID page, so it's like I don't even know what I could say and can't say on the internet. But it's like Dwayne the Rock Johnson on the Kevin Hart roast says the R word. And it's like it seems like everyone's now gets the green light of saying the R word now, right? And it's like it's almost like people are saying it, and it can be in a funny way, so to speak. But it's like, are we learning the lessons that the woke, like saying, like, don't say the R word, like that whole woke movement was trying to kind of instill in us? Like, it feels like we don't, and we just kind of like look at it as like a little phase, and it's like we just did a little rewrite. Oh, we could say the R word now. Oh, I could just rewrite the narrative. And because you have to kind of rewrite the narrative in that way, there's something just like fundamentally wrong with the orientation that we have, where it's like it goes from you can't say it like definitively, and then it goes from now we can say it definitively, and there seems to be no real guardrails at all, and it's just flip flop, and it's just like not right. And I feel like a lot of writers, including myself, like will get into that situation in their writing piece where they flip flop on the writing piece because there's something about their orientation that is too, in my opinion, immature. Actually, there's like an immaturity to it. So basically, my critique is like there's something immature even in like the woke position, and there's an immaturity in this like post woke position as well, that they're both not really appropriate orientations. Um, and obviously, like, yeah, I mean, I think I've made my point, so I'll pass it off.
Outstanding. Well, thank you for being here, and I'll throw it to Aspasia here. So there's many things here to say. That flip-flop is basically what history has been stuck in. I mean, you could look at that in politics, economics, everything. This kind of flip-flopping back and forth that has the illusion of progress, but it is not. It's kind of trapped in a passing over into otherness dialectic without speculative reason. But the principle becomes, what is the speculative reason? Furthermore, I think also, to say something very large, we were talking about this kind of intuition, authentic resonance. Jacob Kashir does important work in resonance as being something tied to the development of the person in a certain way. And there is then a question of the social situations that there is something about social situations that are actually the tests of the degree the individual has followed the sacred romance or not. And the issue is that these social situations, and that's very, very broad, you see, and this goes back to the Friends of the Beautiful conversations, if you're simply following the ethical, here's the problem. These social knots are a product of the ethical, like Mr. Jockin has said, being trapped in the vectors of the good. So if you simply approach these knots in terms of the ethical, you're just going to contribute to the knot, right? And there's an argument to be made that there is something about the following of the sacred romance, and then the question is, what is this? That is actually the development of the subject to be not caught in that knot. And then the question is exactly how are they not? And there's something else here where you gentlemen have been, y'all were trying, Javier was bringing up also this idea of shame versus the beautiful versus good and evil. So it's very interesting because there's a question of, so there's seemingly the opposite of shame is, virtue, the opposite of the beautiful and the virtue, what I'm putting together is shame. But there's also a question of what's the difference between virtue. So you could say there's shameless, shame, and beauty are the three I'm going to say here. You end up in that flip-flop when it's shamelessness, because a lot of the reaction now to woke is not actually beautiful, it's shameless, right? So then it's just the rewrite, right? So the question, and it looks like there's no shame because it's shameless, but actually that is not a sublation. That's actually not working toward the beautiful. But the question becomes the following. How do you actually develop beauty or the virtuous and not just shamelessness? And I think basically when people are trapped in the vectors of the good, the only way that they can overcome shame is to become shameless, which then seems like you're in ethical advancement, but actually you could almost argue it's worse because now you're shameless. But then the question becomes, how do you not end up or live your life in such a manner where the way that you escape the problem of shame is shamelessness as opposed to beauty? I think it's basically the small little decisions to follow the sacred romance in your life. So the other thing is, like, for example, Michelle was bringing up writing. When you choose to write, what is the feeling that people have when they go to write that poem? Shame. Oh, I could be productive. Oh, I'm not very good. Oh, people are going to see. What happens when you start a YouTube channel or start your own entrepreneurship or something? There could be a feeling of what? Shame. And what do you have to do to keep going? Face the shame. And what if we said is the thing you have to overcome to get into the beautiful? Shame. And so these little activities of, say, I'm going to now take a walk in the woods, which is very mysterious, but I feel an authentic resonance compelling us. You can't explain it. So what could stop you from taking that walk in the woods where you look at the moon in the special way that has some sort of wooing? And it gets into this question of inspiration, because I think there's inspiration that can lead to there's inspiration that is actually the wooing of the beautiful, and there's inspiration that leads to shamelessness, because you're inspired by this idea, and you have to be able to tell the difference between the wooing of beauty versus the inspiration of a high that could be distrato. And these are different things. And I think basically the sacred romance gets tied, the authentic resonance, and not to use so many terms, but I think they're all gesturing towards something. And I certainly did like what Christopher Messer Pietro was saying the other day about that was a use of language, because I think this frames very well the difference between what we call discourse, rhetoric, voicecraft, Kafka-likeness. There's a difference between using words to exactly relay information, which actually then leads to a kind of LLM between people, and using words to point at something that the words are failing to get at, but you're actually better for the failure. If you never use words in a way that fails, you don't properly develop. The human needs to go through habits of trying to say something they fail to say, or they actually never, I don't think they actually develop properly. That gets into why poetry, literature, and things like that are very important. But there's something about the activities of following the sacred romance that requires you to face shame. And as you face shame, you also then develop the virtue to actually be acting on behalf of the beautiful, so that when you get into these social knots, there's actually a real alternative as opposed to flip-flopping. I think those are the individual activities that make way for navigating the social knots so that you don't cut off determination. And yet, nevertheless, you do take a stand and have actual terms and things, right? Because those are and these, you could also argue that tension you're describing, if you really want to study that tension, just look at the history of religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and how they, in their religious traditions, have dealt with the exclusion and the inclusion and the keeping in and the keeping out and all of that navigation. I think this might be the age where we need to study those things. But there is something about the individual doing the little activities of facing the fear of shame that then helps them develop the virtue so that they can be beautiful in those social knot situations, as opposed to just flip-flop between shamelessness and shame, which seems like an advancement, but is an illusion. But let me give it to Aspasia and then Michael here. Aspasia, wonderful to see you this morning.
Lovely to see you all. It's very early here, so my brain's not really working. But I wanted to mention the importance of patience and pace in all of this. I think it's relevant. And when I hear phrases like being offended, I'm not quite sure what they mean, to be honest. I think they can mean all sorts of different things. And I think all those phrases, when they start with being, like being angry, being something, again, back to basic distinctions between noticing a feeling state in the body versus actions versus how we go to make meaning and philosophize about something, if we put it in those terms. All of those are they're related to one another, but they are still quite separate in my mind. And so I think when we collapse down something into the expression of being something, there's a lot of problems already, because we can be all talking about different things. And to me, that's part of what I love about writing, is it's actually the space. It's the space to be able to break that down, I guess, because there's something about like a blank page. If I have a pen and a blank page and I have some time, there's something about the pace with which I can go there, which is, obviously when I'm writing alone, which is it affords much more of this ability to be able to notice all those different aspects of what it is to be something, what we mean by that, but also allows that birthing process. So I think a lot of what happens here is our ability to sit with and tolerate and be with what happens in our body. We could call that feelings and emotions, but lots of different things are happening in our body. I know that these are not the most useful distinctions sometimes, but if we just put it in simple terms, and that takes a lot of time sometimes, most times. And I've found that usually the more complex a situation, the more time roughly it's going to take. It could take years for you to really allow something to emerge in the body that is more like feeling states that you have no meaningful words for yet. If you allow it in a certain way, it can gestate and grow something and give rise to what we might call something like a realization or a revelation or something down the line. But that can take a really long time. And the way I see a lot of what goes on in current day is a very sharp shift as quickly as possible into meaning making, understanding, narrativizing. Those things are all so important. I'm not trying to say they're not important. And sometimes we need to try and purposely do that because we are unable to tolerate something else that is happening. And it's helpful. It's a coping mechanism in the moment. But I think confusing that sometimes as it's a coping mechanism for now, it's a placeholder for now, with some sort of definitive outcome, or and also something that means action must swiftly follow from that. You know, so much of this is tied to people's desire to move very quickly into action, which again has its place. But this can all be hijacked and used by the psyche as a way to very quickly move out of something that feels very difficult to hold and feel. It's very difficult to sit with ambiguity or complexity, painful emotions, anger, shame, guilt, grief, all these things. And sometimes, you know, this includes things like mystery and beauty and wonder being hijacked in the same way. We can go into more of an intellectual position of wondering and turning something into a mystery that can sometimes be a quick aborting out of something else that we're feeling. Like if you call it like a gut feeling, you know, everyone knows those feelings that just feel highly uncomfortable in the body. And we want to quickly do something. And again, no one likes to feel powerless in a situation. And so there can be a desire to quickly do and to make meaning that's going to help to orient one's actions so that they have a plan of what they're going to do. And I just, and the difficulty with talking about all of this is that it's obviously not, I'm not implying that this is relevant to every single situation. But I do think it's not spoken about enough, that there is a place for what I would call purposely creating space and allowing something to gestate inside oneself, if we put it in those terms, as you go about your usual day-to-day. And there is something else going on. There is something else brewing and processing, if we put it in those terms. And it can be deeply uncomfortable and it can feel distracting. And sometimes, and there can be moments where you think, oh, like, it's growing now. I'm ready to give birth to it. It's done. And then, you know, sort of 10 minutes later, realizing, no, that was an attempt to get out of it. It's not, you know, and it's hard to talk about these things. It's all very abstract, but it's, I think it's very telling that a lot of this is tied up with quick, impulsive decision-making, but also even if it's not outwardly obvious, going into one's mind to wrap a story around, make meaning about, can also be a way that we are quickly, impulsively trying to move out of something that is happening, that we don't have words for yet, that maybe we're not supposed to have words for yet, that we could learn to carry and hold as we go about our usual day-to-day. There's so much I could say on all of that. But I think it's really important because this is also, this is also work that we are doing that is not obvious to others. There is no pat on the back for it. There is no acknowledgement, even recognition from others around you, unless you're sharing it with them in some format, that's even happening. And that can feel very lonely. And that can also, I think, you know, for lots of people who like to receive some sense externally, you know, from others, reassurance, if we call it that they are, you know, active in the world and they're doing things, and that feels very good to them, that can be very difficult as well. So it can often be very private, quiet work, invisible work. And a lot of this just reminds me of parenting, especially in the very early days. And I really wanted to say mothering, but, you know, it is parenting. But a lot of this reminds me of growing a baby. Everything that you start to feel inside your body during that process, that nobody else would have any idea what's going. You've got, you know, you can feel a baby moving around inside you as you just go about your day. There's something about that process that is incredibly transformative to what I'm talking about right now. And then once you have the baby, it's the same thing, just all the invisible work, everything that you're doing and feeling. It's the feeling, you know. We talk a lot about, obviously, the tasks of parenting and how it's, you know, but it's all the feeling states that go with that, especially in those early days and years, and especially with your first child. It's transformative. You have no idea that what your body is capable of feeling and processing and holding and being with when everyone around you has no idea. You have no idea what it's capable of until, at least I didn't, until I went through that. And so I do think, and it's patient work. This is not to say, I do just want to continue to say, this is not to say that I think that we should be engaging with everything like this, but I do think it's not something that gets as much recognition. And there's a lot of sort of bullishness into what does this all mean, and how is this going to dictate what I do next, and do we have all the necessary information to make a determination, and like this gathering and this. Sometimes you don't need to gather more. What is happening inside you is the thing that maybe you need to be paying more attention to, and if you allow it and connect to it, it is doing something. It almost has its own life, and if you become able to tune into it that way, which is difficult, it's really, really difficult, it creates a lot of anxiety, it can create depression, creates chronic pain, it creates a whole range of neuroses and all sorts of stuff. But if every time you can catch that that's happening and just come back to it and try to allow it to grow, trust the process of it, and it gets more and more uncomfortable, but there's a transformative edge to it. There's a moment to it where it really does feel like it unlocks something, but it's emergent. I don't know. I'm throwing out lots of words. I'm waking up, but it will be birthed in you if you allow it and you give it the room and the space. And it does remind me a little bit of writing. And I know there's different ways of going about writing, and there's different types of writing you're doing. But that's what it feels like, at least for me, when I'm writing. There is sometimes with a blank page, it won't take very long for something to be birthed. Other times I could sit there, you know, there could be nothing for hours. I mean, sometimes I've gone through periods of time where I just cannot write for months. And it's deeply frustrating. But it is ultimately in those times linked to something. And once it emerges, it actually becomes quite obvious to me in retrospect what all that was about. And I wanted to throw that into the mix. It's obviously important to be thinking about the other stuff, but being something, I get very confused about what people mean. And so if someone, you know, like being offended by something, and do we have a right to be offended by something? to me feels almost like a meaningless statement when I break it down like that, because I don't know what we're talking about. Do we have a right to notice feelings start to emerge that are deeply uncomfortable in our body, and it happens very quickly and in a jarring way when someone does something? Well, I don't know about having a right, but it happens. So I could either notice it as a starting point, or I could go somewhere else in my mind to try to moralize it or turn it into something else. And then there's a whole question of, well, what do I do with that thing that's emerging inside me, and how long do I sit with it before I even declare that it's happening, or tell it, like, what do I even do? And there's like 1,000 steps before you even get, in my mind, to action. And when I see all the like outrage culture and all this stuff, it's a lot of that is just what we would call, I guess in clinical terms, acting out. It's just quick, impulsive, act out, show what's happening, show, signal. And I mean, that goes in lots of different directions. But there's real emphasis, obviously, these days on showing immediately what your take is on something. Quick, show, and obviously that has all the implications of connection with others and being part of a social group and making sure what you're showing is in line with others and performing it in a particular way. And people, often confuse that with the processing, and that's helpful, and that's me being connected to my emotions. I don't think that's you being connected to your emotions. I think that's you quickly feeling the smallest tip of an iceberg, breaking it off and throwing it out like a dagger. That's what I think that is. So it just, it drives me a bit nuts, if you can't tell. It all just drives me a bit nuts. But I will sit with that, and I will let that gestate inside, and maybe that will turn into a tree or something that grows nuts. And now we've got into some weird imagery.
No, outstanding.
I'll let you know if the tree grows.
Extremely important. I'll throw it to Michael and Mr. Kashir. So there's a few things. So first off, there is something about shame, because Javier was bringing up shame guilt. I actually associate shame with what you sit with when you don't act, or you're avoiding determination, or you sit and you have gestation. One of the things that compels people out of gestation is shame. Guilt is when you have a determination, you carried out an action that now you kind of like regret or want to get away from. So there's something about shame that's also social, because when you're gestating and you're not acting, you have everyone's looking at you and you're not acting. And how can you stand for these injustices or whatever? And you feel shame that then compels you to act. But then that compelling of action is likely to just add to the noise. And then actually, I think some people avoid shame into an action they feel guilty about, and then they're trapped in the guilt. And then they want to overcome the guilt. But if they haven't trained the culture of avoiding shame, which is the waiting, then they're just going to keep doing things over and over again that they feel guilty about because they don't work or whatever, and it becomes an English cycle. You have to be able to sit in this kind of waiting, that there's a whole lot of shame that can pull you out of. And actually, if you give into that shame, you don't develop beauty. And there's a few more things. I associate philosophy very much with actually not making, like a certain sort of stopping yourself from judging and acting. Like you think you know. It can seem like it's actually a meaning making from a place of not knowing. Like it's really important. There's different ways of making meaning. There's this, I know the case, and you rush ahead, this virilio speed that's very problematic. But then there's this meaning that arises from a kind of resonance or beauty or surprise that requires you actually to stop yourself, to not close things too quickly. Now, here's the issue. This actually, and for me, does point to why philosophy without resonance, without virtue, without beauty is doomed. Because if Socrates is like, though I know he knows nothing, well, what value is that state if all you have is the good, or, the world's going to end? But if it was the case that a state of holding yourself back, I know know nothing, is precisely when the sacred romance can call you, when you can get an intuition of the proper action that then leads you toward the beautiful. This is the most important thing in the world. But if you lose the beautiful, to not know anything is simply not to know what's good, and that's why you get deconstruction. Philosophy without the beautiful leads to deconstruction, because philosophy wants to slow you down, to stop, to don't judge so quickly. Like, what do you know? Who do you know? Don't judge. Like, log in your eye, et cetera, so forth. Don't create a determination so quickly. Let the determination arise in concert with the world and other people, not just your own sort of understanding, which then, of course, that creates fragmenting, because everyone's in their own interpretation of the situation, and that's what destroys couples, because there is no understanding of how actually allowing this waiting and gestation, this state of where you don't know, is precisely the precondition of the strike of beauty. It's precisely, that's where resonance can't come in unless you're slowing down. Like resonance comes in when you say, I don't know, right? Now, of course, the fear is then, well, what if like you don't take an action and something bad happens? The fear of the bad, right? Well, that means courage. You have to actually have courage to develop resonance in this way. I have far more notes, but I'll throw it to Michael here, Jacob, and then Mr. Luber. Michael, please.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, a lot of thoughts. I think what you were saying there about slowing down is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and just kind of the image of like waiting for the dust to settle, or waiting for like the hourglass to you know have all the sand fall to the bottom, and how it often feels courageous to kind of take that initial step, and to meet fire with fire, or to kind of like make some big declaration, or yeah, just like kind of dramatically alter your life. But that can also be that can also be fueled by an insecurity of like, I want to be perceived as though I'm taking action, right? Especially if you're one who has kind of played life safe, or has kind of like tended to be more passive. It's like, okay, like you read about the hero's journey, or participating in your life, and you're like, okay, great. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna try that. But it can, yeah, it can often leave you more out of alignment with yourself, because you're not listening for the frequencies of of the world outside of you, of the universe, of the other, if you're in a relationship with someone, like the other person. And it can become like this kind of like warrior mentality. And there's like a beauty of like the warrior archetype, but it can kind of become like bullish almost. And I think that's when I've experienced shame. And I know people are like making distinctions between shame and guilt in the chat. Like when I've experienced, like, shame for me is like when I don't act in alignment with my my deepest self. And it's like I know that I think guilt is like much more kind of circumstantial. Like someone used the example of like eating a donut when you're on a diet. Like it's kind of much more like local, and shame is much more like, oh, I really did something deeply like offensive to myself, or like, if you believe in God, like offensive to God. And often those times have come when I've been the most like sure about what I'm doing in the moment. Like I'm so convicted that I actually am like blind to like the broader circumstance and like what it's calling for. And then I'm like, oh, okay. Like that was, I missed the mark there. And it's kind of all like recalibration. And I wonder how this, I'll throw it back. I wonder how this connects to, I've been thinking a lot about freedom recently. And just some things have come up in my personal life, like between my partner and I, that have just made me think a lot about that. And like what it means to value freedom, and to what end freedom is like exercised. Because I see how for some people freedom is almost like akin to a like abandonment of responsibility or something. And it's like, I just want to live by, the seat of my pants, and live like impulse to impulse kind of thing. And that can often be a response to like a very constricting upbringing or something. And how that can feel really good for a time, but I think it can bring up shame. very like I think those two can be often linked. And so like how to think of freedom that, I know you talk about freedom in Daniel, and how to think of a freedom that is like that has a relationship to constraints, but it's like ultimately the experience of flow in that, that actually brings someone more closely connected to their life, as opposed to either fleeing their life, like freedom to do something that's kind of like connected to the like what they're trying to run away from, or simply trying to like make sure that they're free from persecution or discrimination or something, but then their life is kind of lived with that paranoia, almost that fear of that being taken away. And so yeah, I'm kind of losing the thread a little bit, but that's kind of just I've just been thinking a lot about that, especially in, I guess, the context of romantic relationships, where it's just something I'm bumping up against right now, and I think is like very common for people to bump up against, is like ideas around freedom, and how to have those aligned in a partnership.
Oh no, it's completely massive. I'll throw it to Jacob and then Andrew here. To say something very large, I personally don't feel free unless there is some sort of sense of a calling or call or an intuition or authentic resonance. And what's interesting about that is then you're deciding what you want to be free from relative to what makes that call more pronounced. And I think that is basically the intuition or the lead to beauty. And then there's also, as Jochen has been teaching on, something about actually beauty is basically kind of the test of the worthiness of freedom. Actually, that there's a judgment of joy. I think joy as well, actually, because there's a judgment in joy, right? Like, I don't think humans feel free unless you wake up and you feel something, a certain wooing, a certain sort of call, a certain sort of this way. But I actually think you basically can't have that freedom unless you face shame, because there's also something to be said if we take, and I think I agree with you, and of course these things overlap between guilt and shame, and I think the distinctions are actually quite important. There seems to be something about shame that is wider, and shame seems to be tied to how people see you, where guilt can be tied to how you see yourself, right? Like guilt can have a certain, I see myself as a failure. Shame can be, I'm seen as a failure. And this also gets into where actually people will sometimes talk about Eastern societies as shame society, Western as guilt. Now, those are big overlaps. But this is also why you'll actually see in Eastern societies some kind of ideas of, if you're not caught doing it, then it's fine. Like, actually, you're intelligent if you can figure out how to kind of get in bed with the government and make money. And I'm not trying, it's just that there are different views of what is rational and right in different things based to shame and guilt. And there seems to be some sort of necessity, because then you can have guilt that paralyzes people in the West and that manipulates people. So there's ditches on either side of the road, of course. But the point is that there's something about shame that has a certain collectivity. And I don't know if you can really fully be human if you don't face the same, like face courageously the shame of being seen as wasting your life. Like, if you never face the shame of being seen as someone who's not making the most of your potential, or et cetera, so forth, I think that is going to go a long way to you being incapable to find freedom in something. Because the thing you find freedom in something tends to be a resonance or call that can only come on the other side of that shame, because you have to get through that shame to actually be toward the beautiful. And you see, then here's the key. You're determining freedom from and freedom to relative to what enables that freedom in, the call as such, right? And I think then also what you're trying to do is say in a relationship, what are the actions that help both people in the relationship hear the call? Hear the freedom in, feel the intuition, beyond the questions of, do we want to have kids or not? Do we want to be free from this or not? What is the proportion? What is the mean? What is the state? And Daniel, wonderful to see. What is the state that actually seems to then unlock the sacred romance, where when you wake up, you feel like there's actually something calling you in a certain sense? And call is always that, that's a religious term, but there's something about that which makes you feel like your actions are not arbitrary, like they're not just arbitrary, but they also don't feel chaotic. And also they feel like a choice, because you have to choose to respond. Ross Barrett has talked about call and respond as the kind of logic of the world, right? Like, you have to choose to respond to that. And of course, that will require you to face the shame of people thinking you're wasting your potential or just crazy or something, right? And I think writing is a wonderful practice of habituating yourself to an experience like that, because Michelle was meeting writing at the very beginning, especially if you're not just writing to write down how everyone but you is wrong. If you go into writing to actually have that sort of openness, there's something about that that can kind of begin training you and habituating you toward the experience of following something you can't completely articulate but can sense. And then also perhaps train your character to help other people sense it around you as well in their own unique lives, etc. But let me pause and throw it to Jacob Cashier and then Andrew Luber. Mr. Jacob Cashier, it is wonderful to see you. Thank you for coming today, sir.
Great to be here with y'all. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of interesting threads floating around the room. One important nuance I wanted to bring is that in my experience, the shame is often the internalization of a perceived external voice rather than an actual external voice. So it's not that I live in a society where I'm getting that feedback of like, oh, you didn't make this much money or you haven't filed your taxes. That's so shameful. Like, no. In my experience, I lack almost all of that feedback, but there's an internalized version of it. And so the shame is kind of like an internal representation of an external voice. And I think that's often the most challenging thing is like the internal audience, the internal kind of crowd who's judging you rather than that you're actually being confronted by that judgment. I really liked what Aspasia was bringing in. It reminded me a lot of what David Bohm and Peter Garrett talked about when they started doing the Bohm dialogue of suspension, the importance of suspension, which could also be described as stillness, suspension of judgment, and just holding in that space actually feels like pretty close to one of the most important skills you could possibly have as a spiritual being. Yeah. Yeah, and it's also where divine presence can be coming into relationship with whatever is occurring. So if there's no stillness, then it's kind of just in your own subjectivity. But if you are dealing with a challenge or a problem or a crisis of perception, and then you can create a suspension around it, even just with yourself, then that's where God basically can enter the scene. But then also equally, you can think about how that works in a collective context or relational context. Like suspension within the group allows something else to come into the picture, and that transforms it. And that's kind of that's like a solving. It's a way of solving for closed box problems with something that's not inside of the closed box of the problem. Often, the last piece I wanted to touch on from Mr. Luba, there was a great meme that I saw probably a few years ago now, and it's like Atlas holding up the world, and the meme is like, oh yeah, the world is like freedom of speech, and then Atlas with his back is people who still say gay and retarded. And it just hit me in that way that a meme does that sticks with you, like, oh, there's some grain of truth in this. And I've thought about it a lot in the years since, and I think there's obviously a reactionary version of this, which is maybe like the childish insistence upon saying those things, because screw you, mom and dad, or screw you, woke authority, or whatever. And there's clearly a multitude of contexts in which using those words is really not wise or appropriately fitted. But there are contexts in which it is fitted. And I will die on that hill. And I think that that is the salt of the earth. And I think that if we lose that, we lose the whole game. I really do. There's an interesting dynamic that mirrors this a lot that I have with Jordan Bates, who I'm working on rap projects with, and we're both broadly in the conscious rap space. We're both very aware of rap as like transmitting a frequency, and we're not trying to put bullshit on those frequencies. We're trying to transmit a very high frequency that inspires us and calls us forward. So, and in the same way, your own words, your own speech, you want those things to be ennobling. But we have found it, for whatever reason, extremely necessary to open a space that we call shadow bars, that Seth actually was witness to during our last retreat around the campfire. And in the shadow bar space, we more or less intentionally opening a space to bring forward all those things we otherwise would never get to express, those parts we would never say, in a playful way, but we're bringing forward all that sexual energy, all that aggressive energy, all that shadow energy, all that dominant energy, and we're bringing it forward into the rap and into the space of play. And then it can be brought into the light of the group and not shamed and not buried. So, and there's a certain kind of trust that I feel when I'm with somebody and they can do whatever is the thing that we're like, it's not about saying the word retarded. It's about that thing that is outside of the social bounds, outside the bounds of normativity, that you can both dare to go into. And in doing so, it's like, all right, I see you, you see me. Like, I trust you, actually. I trust that I could say that thing that's outside of the bounds and not have you switch into kind of like a social programming that has you now view me as an enemy or an outsider or someone who can't be engaged with. So there's something really, really important buried in there, and it's a good test of character, I think, whether people can actually encounter those parts and not freak out or shut down. But there's a very subtle distinction between doing that and actually just like mindlessly feeding those more shadowy elements.
Absolutely. No, very well put.
Thank you.
As a note, and I'll throw it to Mr. Luber here. There's something here about relationality, like voicing the dark for the sake of destroying everything versus and to provoke everything versus the dark precisely so that we are anti-fragile and don't kill one another. Like, and also my favorite book on freedom of speech is Jonathan Rout's Kindly Inquisitors. I would require everyone in the world to read it. I know that's a giant claim, but it is the best book on freedom of speech and actually what happens to a society without it. And it's not merely about expression. It's actually tied to the ability to think, knowledge acquisition, the ability of the democracy not to eat itself. Jonathan Rout is quite a gem on that topic. And furthermore, when you talk about free speech, there's a paper in Belonging Again called Equality and Its Immoral Limits, where there's always this question of who do we want to extend equality to, right? And you would say, do you want the murderer to have the same equality as the non-murderer? You say no, because they've done something immoral. But this is the issue. What we want, like the range of freedom and the range of equality is relative to what we believe is right and wrong. Right. And so this is very important because if we're all trapped in vectors of the good or ideas of ethics, then basically that almost by definition means we're going to silo. And I think when you were mentioning Bohm, there's this idea of suspending of judgment, doing an opening, like it's keeping a certain opening that without that ultimately at the end of the day, without this opening, there will be no social. It will eventually lead to isolated individuals at a certain point. Like the logic of it, like, let me put it this way. If the ability to suspend judgment or create a kind of clearing, to use that Heideggerian term, is actually, I think, strongly tied to the role of what philosophy actually is, to allow meaning to emerge, as Aspasia was saying, as opposed to making meaning. Like one of the reasons you need philosophy is because people are making meaning in a problematic way. Right? They're already doing it. They're already coming up with judgments. It's not that philosophy is just about coming up with the meaning of things when no one else is. It's actually about letting the meaning actually be more open or actually kind of, and basically, if you have a people that cannot do that, the logical endpoint of that is the end of the social. It will just be isolated individuals and the state. That's what you'll have. And that's what we have now. The state, the upper of Juvenal, or the lower, the individual. And without collective action possibilities, don't be surprised if there are no new significant changes of the possibility of the social. I think also, I'm glad you brought up the effect. There's something for me, I'm not a big fan when people talk about being offended, because it is basically anger with determination. because you don't want to say I'm angry. You want to say I'm offended, because when I say I'm offended, that means you're wrong. When I say I'm angry, then maybe I'm wrong, because we all know that there could be a problem with anger. So what's happening when somebody asserts their offense, there's a certain sort of, I'm saying you're wrong, right? Well, why not just say you're angry and force and relinquish the image or control of the narrative? To say I'm offended means you're trying to control the narrative with your anger. Whereas if you simply said, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, I'm angry. Aspasia talks very well on this, but then you don't control the narrative. In fact, people may say you in the wrong, right? So what's happening there is it's doing what Luba was pointing to, where you're closing in the statement of offense, right? You're treating it with a determination as opposed to actually having it open. Because if I say I'm angry, well, that could actually be a space of dialogue, right? But if I say I'm offended, there's nothing to talk about, right? So, and it's very interesting how you can take the same emotional state and do it either way. Like if I say I'm sad, that could be an opening. But if I say I'm upset with you, or even I'm upset, there's a big difference between I'm sad and I'm upset. Upset means there's no space, right? And it's interesting to go through all of the different emotions and see how we actually tend to load the dice in favor of our narratives, which can be very, very problematic. I think it's also, too, I'm really glad you said that part about, and I'll throw it to Luba here, what you were saying about the perceived collective of shame. I think that's extremely important. And it's just interesting because now I'm thinking about shame as a kind, how we're talking about call, which of course is a religiously loaded term. There's a certain call, a sort of wooing, a certain sacred romance, a certain thing calling you to do things that are hard to understand, and yet you feel like you should. And that actually leads you in a certain development. It's interesting to think about shame, therefore, as the anti-call. Like it's kind of the anti-call because it's like the perceived obstruction that is saying, don't do that. Versus the call is actually tied to, you could say, divinity or tied to the beautiful. So it's interesting to think about shame as anti-call in a certain way. I was thinking about, let me stop though and throw it to Mr. Luber and then Michael. And if anyone has anything to say, I will have to go at 5 p.m. this evening because of wedding venue and it looks like a giant storm. So this will be fun. But that's an hour from now, but let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
Oh boy, good luck. Wow, I am amped to be back. Like, oh my God. Like, I feel like, I don't know if it's you guys, if it's just me, or if you guys feel this way. I feel like this is like a new net. Like this is like a new era that I didn't even know if I could love the net even more than I did, honestly, because I loved it before. Okay, there's so many interesting things. I really want to talk about the offensive, but first I just want to say, just so I don't forget it, because I want to tie it back later. The question of shame being a perceived thing, or if it's real, is a contention. Because I know. Basically, if it is the juxtaposition to beauty, then it has to be real. It can't be perceived. So I want to talk about what that would mean more. But first, okay. But first, the offensive. Yeah, this is the ontology. The ontology part is very interesting because it's the same thing that I was saying earlier, just in different words, where it's like the origin of surprise, whether it needs to be fiction or if it is real. Like it needs, like what's the actual necessity? Because that's and maybe thinking about it in terms of necessity might not be the best. But anyway, with offensive, I want to propose a third thing, because I think, Daniel, you were touching on this, but I'm not positive if you were. Basically, I totally agree with everything Aspasia was saying. Like, how could you not, basically? You got anger. The juxtaposition there is like you got the anger, saying I'm angry or versus I'm offended. I think both situations call for a lack of curiosity is my problem. Like I'm okay with you feeling however you feel. Like that's not the issue for me. It's about what's in framing the situation. Like what's an appropriate way for a situation to be framed? That's the question that I'm having. So like, I think me using the word offensive is basically just a way of saying, yeah, the situation has now been framed in a certain way. And I will now be curious to this extent, if at all, not at all. Maybe there's no more curiosity, and my behavior will also be greatly diminished. So basically, like, what you're willing to for your mind and your body is what both of those aspects are willing to do in the situation that there's some response to, whether you call it angry or offended. It doesn't, like, those are almost situational words, and they're not getting at the actual ontological aspect that I'm trying to point at, in my opinion. So, like, I don't think it's a clear answer when a situation, from a general standpoint, when it's, oh, this is inappropriate in framing, and that is the inframing, because there's a couple complications that go with it, which is one of them being the concept of newness, the concept of sublation, the concept of basically any kind of transitory concept. It has to be addressed, and it's like, okay, well, the inframing has to be in time, so it moves. So how does the inframing change and yet remains to be the same inframing? Because there has to be basically there has to be. And I was listening to some talk. I think it was the Mikey Downs one where the guy was talking about the lose. I was like, oh my God, Daniel's been talking about the lose, blah blah blah. I haven't really read them like crazy at all, and let me listen to this and see if I can learn something. A really interesting distinction is the tree growing versus a meadow growing. The difference and what that means. Is there a hierarchy, or is there a mode in which existence is as such where you can't tell the beginning and end? Right. So, like, that to me is at the root. So, like, how that affects everyday life to me, like, that issue is, if there is a hierarchy, then there should be distinctions, and one side of the distinction should be prioritized over the other. If there isn't a hierarchy, so for example, with what I just said before I go to the next part, so, like, you would prioritize anger over offensive in a certain sense. That way, and you rationalize the justification of it. It's like, oh yeah, if your anger is what habilitates your curiosity, that's better than if it's offensive, so to speak. Like, that to me might be fitting for the time now, but that might not work in a future time. Like, to me, that's very momentary, a moment or a situation. I don't think that could be like a rule for all future and possible situations. The other way, which I'm more inclined, like, if you can't tell, where it's like not actually a hierarchy per se. It's more like the meadow, where you can't from your positionality of your finite positionality, you can't see the beginning or end. So that would mean that you have to look at the situation in terms of not the distinctions that are made, like, for instance, offensive and anger. It's more about you looking at it from what is going to make the subject in the situation more or less active, which is a different mindset completely. That to me is like more storyteller. Like, sure, it might help you get to that mindset of thinking about an active or passive character by using words like anger and offensive, but it's not the actual end all be all. So I just want to tie this in with the shame part and the ontology issue that I'm pointing, or not issue, but just question that I'm getting at now, is the nature of what makes the subject active, or rather, what is the nature of getting the subject to be more active? Let's say, maybe that's a better way of looking at it. Does that need to be real, or does it could it be a fiction that's felt real? And in that sense, what's the difference? Or does it need to be it needs to be corroborated outside of it being real to you as a subject? That is the thing, because the answer to that question will help shape society. Like, society right now, because it's more horizontally, sorry, I'm running across the street right now. Society is more horizontally shifted right now, which to me, like, how I would map that onto what I'm saying is like, society thinks that it has to be real outside of the subject. That's the horizontal leans in that direction more, where to me, the vertical actually leans more into the emotive subjectivity part. Well, I feel it, it feels real to me, and therefore it doesn't matter if it's a fiction at that point. That's more on the vertical side of things, in my opinion. And maybe I'm wrong with that mapping, but I do think if you're agnostic, which I am, I think you have to, the position is, how am I being more active in this particular situation, and what tools? Because sometimes you need to be more horizontal and sometimes you need to be more vertical. That's what I think agnostic would mean, where you kind of have to just use the tools that make you more active, and the grand nature of the origin of the surprise, that framing, like, that doesn't really matter. So it doesn't really matter if you're and just to tie back to the offended thing, it doesn't really matter if you use the word offended or anger, because that's not the concern. That's like, naming it is irrelevant. It's all about what's making me more active, basically. And that's why I love the beauty position, because I think it brings you to this place where things are real, but I don't need to name, or you don't need to go crazy into the theological realm. And you could actually, for like the secular person, you could actually work with it better, because you don't have to go into that theological realm. For like the reasons that I was saying. And if it's not clear like why that's the case, like, I'll gladly explain more, but I just want to get off because I feel like I've been talking a lot and I know you have a time crunch. So I shall pass it off.
You were saying, well, there's outstanding. So there's a bunch of things. And I'll give it to Michael and then Seth here. So there's also, so with what you were saying on anger, so there's I'm offended determination. Then there's I'm angry, which is being used for determination, or you use the anger to stoke it. Like you feel anger, because there's also an issue here where you can feel anger and not will it. It just happens, right? And so there could be the statement, I am angry, as an acknowledgement that something has occurred that actually could be a clearing for curiosity. Because why did anger show up here when I didn't will it or I didn't choose it, right? And so actually the expression of anger could actually be a shared curiosity about why what you did made me feel angry, and how can we explore that, and what does that mean about one another? I will certainly say for Michelle, and we talk about this a lot for Michelle and I think this is actually very important for marriages. There's something actually very important about saying, I am angry, so why? It's not a you're wrong, but actually this happened. And if it's not acknowledged, there could be a repression and nothing could change. It could be a problem. It actually becomes exploratory, right? So you have to actually, so there's a offended, I'm offended as in determination. I'm angry, and then I'm going to stoke it because that person's an a-hole. So now you're taking the anger to be right. And then there's anger has emerged. Why? And what does this mean? And exploring it. And you could do that for every single emotion. I do think you're right that the words do not matter. I suppose what I want to say is the words do not matter, but perhaps the sentences do. Because if I say I'm offended, and I want to talk to you about why, and maybe I'm in the wrong, notice how that sentence creates an opening. But if I say and maybe you could use it interchangeably, right? I could say I'm angry, but that doesn't mean I'm right. And why is that? So it is, I think, important to use language, because language is real, because there is this ontology question that's being asked, and my notes are being blown away as the superstorm comes. There is this thing where words matter, because words create orientation. And I think there's something about using language in a manner to make sure that openness is still there, that shared exploration, right? And that perhaps is not a matter of particular words, but can be tied to sentences and paragraphs and entire expressions. And I don't think we want to be paranoid about a particular word, but I suppose sometimes in philosophical discussions, distinctions between terms can be used as revelations of different contexts and different sentences, right? Now, on the reality question, there's something about the I think what you're asking about the shame as real or not is tied to almost the Margaret Thatcher question of, is the social real or not? Because the whole libertarian question is, does the social exist? There's no such thing as society, only individuals, right? And so that led to an entire political philosophy that could be problematic. So there's a weird way, perhaps it is this, and I'm now thinking of abstraction. So I think you have to go through, perhaps there's a perceived and an actual version of all things that is tied to a, dare I say, ascension of the soul or development of the person. So first, you face the perceived shame that no one has actually said, and you have to spend 5 years developing that and facing that. But then there's the speaking on a stage or having control over a business where you make a mistake and there's actual shame because everyone's looking at you and telling you it was a bad decision, right? And perhaps the facing of the perceived shame that Jacob was pointing to, that I think is very important, is actually, if you haven't been doing that in your quiet time or in your writing, then when it comes to the experience of actual shame, you won't be prepared for it. And then if you're actually prepared for the actual shame, it retrospectively makes the perceived shame have reality in so much as it was part of the unfolding. Because I think the real ontology is the unfolding. Like, it is actually the entire journey of development that occurs. Because on the question between a tree and a meadow, I want to say something like, the meadow cannot be a meadow without also being the conditions of possibility for a tree to grow. You can't have a meadow be itself without also being an environment for a tree, right? And so there's also something about a tree, but there's something about a tree, and I guess this would be the Deleuzian point, which I'm sympathetic to as much as I understand Deleuze, which after so many years, I'm still not sure. There's something about there's something about the meadow, that the truth of the meadow is actually the layers of possibility for the meadow versus the meadow in the tree. The reality is the possibility of a tree growing in the meadow, or there being a tree that then the forest actually over time turns into a meadow. The reality is the development and the unfolding. And what I want to say is, I think basically that's why Deleuze needs the anagon, as Jochen we've talked about, with the transversality, and he doesn't get, because that's actually the movement through the stages. So the sacred romance, the resonance, the authentic resonance, all of that is the movement for the stages. And the reality is the ability to move through the stages, which autonomous rationality alone cannot do, because it's going to be stuck in the either or, tree or meadow. What's the most rational thing for this moment? Well, actually, it can vary on the different stages, but you have to sense into that. And basically, there's something about a way, basically, this is the point. To the degree you have been making openings in your life, as Jacob was talking with Bohm, an opening when you voice, I am angry, you're using it as an opening for the other. To the degree you have been doing that in as many possible areas of your life as possible will be to the degree you are habituated to sense the intuition leading you to the stages, that if you have not been doing it, you will not sense it. And so you'll just be stuck back and forth in the flip-flopping that Mr. Luber was pointing to. But let me give it to Michael here and then Seth. Michael, please.
Yeah, I think that that everything you said is spot on. Is like there's a closing function to saying I'm offended or I'm angry. It's like a big period, like a big punctuation mark at the end of that, as opposed to like a comma or an ellipses or something. And there's like ultimately I feel like it's masking some type of fear of what if I suspend my judgment about something the other person believes that I don't like, that I actually find we have more that we agree about than we disagree. And that's um that's that's terrifying. I think that it's because it's like a frame breaking experience for someone to be like, oh, like the you know like the conservative actually has really valid and understandable reasons for their opinion on abortion or something. And it's, I think the suspension of judgment is about creating space for a transformation, for a new experience, a new insight and like a new experience. And it's inherently shaky ground, like unstable ground for people to stand on, because it's like you're building like a new foundation, like tile by tile. And if you open yourself in that way, you could actually have all of your preconceived notions confirmed, like, oh, um this person actually is like unsafe or whatever. But like I think the key move is, when you said I'm angry, why, is no matter what emotional experience you have, like it it's able to teach you something. And I think that's the curiosity, to like turn inwards. It's like what is this revealing about, like, you know, maybe my own baggage, my own, like, whatever I'm bringing into this situation, how I'm not seeing reality clearly. And that's that's always a valuable undertaking. Um, and, um, and yeah, and like without blaming someone else, without getting defensive, without placating, like it's a real skill to, you know, to just plainly say what it is that you're going through, without reaching for all of these, yeah, like reaching for all of these different um projections or conclusions. Like we often have something happen to us and then immediately create a story that is like an internally consistent system, um as opposed to, like, constructing a story that leads to an opening, that leads to more possibility, um instead of less. And because, like, someone was talking about story earlier, kind of in like a pejorative sense, like creating a story about the other that is like kind of a confirmation bias that reduces them to something. Um, but I know, like, people here will talk about story in like a much different way as well. Like the the other possibility for story to be something that invites people into like a participation. And I think if it's like on the scale of like like a relationship between two people, like the experience of co-constructing a story together, as opposed to I have my story about you and you kind of have to just accept it. Or if you don't accept it, you can leave, and like it just ends. Um, and I think that suspension of judgment allows the space for like two like equal subjects to be able to, like, contribute to it. Um, and yeah, that like that's it's it's a really it's a really hard skill. And there's also, I think, for me at least, there's like an internal kind of shame narrative when I do that, of like, oh, like you're just kind of like a, you know, centrist cuck who like can't take an opinion on anything. You know, you're like you're always like you're just always suspending judgment, and you're just always like, okay, taking the middle ground kind of thing. But it's as I've gotten older, I've at least tried to see how it's like different from that in like an important way. Like it's like I don't know, it's like it's an attempt to like to hold the complexity as opposed to just take the easy way out of like, oh, I don't really feel anything. Like it's actually an experience of like I acknowledge how much there is here to be felt and experienced. And I don't want to rush into like double clicking on anger or one thing because then it like discounts everything else. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, I think that's magnificent. And there is that tension of taking a certain middle. I'll give it to Seth here, Mr. Luber, and if anyone has any final things. I think you can still hear me, but it's raining so hard you may not. And when Jacob was here, he saw the entire porch blown away. I'll never forget that. That was great. That was great. There is something about, yes, there is a weird tension here between taking the middle and it feeling like a certain escape, a certain avoidance, a certain not wanting to offend anyone. Because there is this way where if you act in a manner trying to make sure nobody is offended, then you're actually operating according to offense and it's not a clearing, right? It's like having the opposite of shame be shamelessness. It's not actually an opening, right? So what do you need to do? There's a question of what do you need to do to make sure taking a quote unquote middle position is a clearing, a kind of opening, as opposed to I'm going to take the middle position to actually shut down the dialogue, because some centrists will do that, right? They'll say, well, it's both and it depends. Well, then there's nothing to discuss. Everyone will just in their own independent situations decide what to do, right? So there is a form of centricism that seems as if it's inviting democracy, but actually in a way shuts down democracy because it's just whatever for people in a certain way, right? I think generally speaking, the center, if you take your center position, which you almost want to say complexity position, if we're using that term today, because there's a way in which the center is only valid, the middle position is only valid in so much as it's a complexity position, right? We tend to say the middle, but really it's not, the virtue of it is not that it's middle, but that it's holding complexity. So maybe there's a sense instead, we'll say the complexity decision. Okay, well, how do you make sure, or how do you increase the probability for yourself that you're taking a complexity position as opposed to a middle position, if you understand that distinction, right? I think because it requires courage. If your complexity position actually is going to be something that is terrifying to you or demands something of you, like we were saying with Brandon that day with the abortion debate and all those different things, or it actually is going to put a demand on you, you can only take the middle in so much as it puts a demand on you, as if it says something for you. And it actually then is going to perhaps give up your image of, or the moment then you are at risk of people seeing you as a centrist coward. Well, then actually it might be holding the complexity because you have to face the fear of being called that, right? So if you have to face that, right? So there's something about actually like in an issue like abortion, like we were saying that example, well, imagine you're a pro-life, but your own daughter has been raped and she's looking and you're thinking about abortion and the entire church is saying she's going to go to hell. Like create a situation. Don't just talk about the middle. Think about a situation where your own family or friends are in the position of taking the opposite position of what you strongly hold and feel that. Go write a story about that. Like put yourself in the emotional crucible of that experience because now you're developing complexity in yourself. Like if you're not developing inner space or complexity in yourself, then you're not taking a complexity position. You're just taking a middle position, which can actually be a certain threat to democracy. So I think this is actually where philosophy and writing and then, of course, if you did all that, I think it's going to be more gestational in the way that Aspasia was talking about, which I think is extremely important. I have a lot more notes, but I'm going to stop and throw it to Seth here. Seth, please. Thank you for coming today, sir.
Yeah, great to be back at the net. So I hope this will not muddy the waters, but was thinking right from the beginning when Michelle was talking about writing, and I was thinking of the social coordinating mechanism and literally that word coordination. So there's the gestation of an idea, there's sitting down to write it, there's actually feeling that you externalize the inner inspiration faithfully. Then there's, if we're speaking of the internet, there's putting it out there. Then there's someone seeing it. Then there's whether the tone or the frequency that I transmitted actually resonates on the other side. And then, you know, maybe relationship develops from that. But there's this, there's all these little points along the way where it can resonate or not. And I think what we've been talking about in terms of, you know, if we're here in the same Zoom room and we're talking, or if you're in some social situation, people are talking, it's the same thing. It's maybe at a faster rate because, you know, everyone's talking and then I think of something and I say it, but I feel something, and then I transmit it and it lands or it doesn't land or something like that. I also wanted to bring in tempo because it's come up about slowing down. Well, slowing down is also relative. It's slower than this or faster than that. And you can slow down. Slowing down for one person isn't slowing down for the other one, I guess is what I want to say. Like in the practice I do of the Feldenkrais method, which is very much built upon slowing down, often it's like, well, can I get the person to go slower than they're going now? And they might still be doing something that to me looks like rushing, but relative to what they've done, they've come to a slower place, so it's like a new perception. But I can also insist on slowness as some sort of a, you know, we do slow here, and I can go so slow that it drives them crazy. They can't, it's too much, right? So there's a calibration, you know, so if you and I are going to slow down together, we have to actually find a place that actually means slow for both of us, which is not always easy. I was thinking also of, Daniel, your conversations with Michelle on the judgment of joy. And if I understood it right, a summary would be something like how to be joyful always in all situations, which is pretty damn hard in a lot of situations. But it's kind of the refusal to allow this situation to discard joy. So if I have certain principles about what a good life is and that I want to share those principles with others, I don't want to violate their opportunity for a good life. You know, if someone's yelling or cursing at me, it becomes a lot harder to hold on to that. But as I understood it, the judgment of joy is a sort of very deep grounding in that sense of I am still holding care for everyone present. And of course, I always have more access to my inner experience than anyone else's inner experience. But, and I think this is super interesting, complexity versus just sort of like, you know, boneless skeleton, boneless centrism where you just don't want it. But I think what I would associate, and I also think this is incredibly difficult. Like, it's a good thing we can hang out at the net and just try to differentiate these different layers, because I think when we go out into the world at this point, it's really difficult. It's just really difficult. People are don't have shared principles, don't have shared understanding, and then a lot of people don't even have an acknowledgement that we don't have shared principles and understanding. Like, it's one thing to be in your own worldview. It's another thing to not conceive that anyone else could have a different worldview. And I think I've encountered that, you know, quite a number of times. And so if you're going to be holding something like the judgment of joy, how do you approach the person who cannot hear you? Like, this is something came up recently in a conversation I did with Larissa Babi, who's in Ukraine, and she wanted to discuss the Declaration of Independence. And we were discussing, there's a paragraph, you know, they've laid out all the complaints against the king, but then there's this paragraph about our British brethren, you know, the US founders, And it basically says, well, we've appealed to them. And it calls them their brethren. And, you know, they're at first the brethren, or British brethren, they're not King George. But then it's like, we appealed, we said this, and they didn't listen, and we couldn't. And so in the end, the document says, during war, if you're wearing that uniform, you're the enemy and we'll kill you, right? It's just sort of like under these circumstances. But it's this incredible clarity. It's at very least, it's like, here's the criteria that we're working with. That's maybe a bit of a jump, but that would be, I brought that up as an example of the person who's not, who can't hear you or won't listen. But what I want to say, and I think this is very difficult, is that, and this is what I try to do when I notice myself in a situation that feels really fraught with different ideas of what's offensive, or, you know, or you can tell when someone is speaking through the filter of shame. You can say, oh my gosh, they just have this demeanor where it seems like they almost don't feel that they have the right to speak, and you can feel that. You can feel all these energies. My attempt is to adopt all bodies in the room as part of my own nervous system, right? And this is an act of imagination, but it's also like, if I'm tracking the other as I speak, or if I'm not speaking, but I'm tracking the room as this person speaks, right? I might simultaneously think, I agree with you, and that person looks offended, and this person's bored, and, you know, you're raising your voice, and all of those things just happen. And there's no simple like formula for what I do with that, but it's just like, I think, Daniel, we're saying it's in the continuing unfolding. And so I think the greater degree of, for lack of a better word, I'll just say presence that we can bring, we can be more aware of all of the different frequencies that are changing, because there's always multiple frequencies, right? And sometimes they make a chord that sounds harmonious, and sometimes we have something more like dissonance. Sometimes there's a feeling of rushing, sometimes there's a feeling of dragging. And then I think there can be a moment of, and I think part of how you get there in a complex situation where people are in different places is that you're holding space for the potential for a kind of a musicality where everyone in the ensemble begins to feel it, something like that. I think sometimes just speaking to what I'm observing, like, oh, I noticed when you said that, several people were nodding their head, or something like that. It's trying to presence more of, I don't know, what's going on. And of course, my perception could be flawed, but that's kind of the intention. Yeah, and so this is just one other thing kind of connected to this. So the insides and the outsides, right? So I have all these thoughts, I have these feelings, they're bottling up, and now I'm going to express myself. You know, if that becomes too, if it is like a bottled up and release, I'm probably not going to strike the right chord to continue with that metaphor. So I guess it's another way of saying what I already said, but can I adopt the idea that maybe there aren't so much insides and outsides, without ignoring, of course, that the thoughts in my head are only available to me and no one else is hearing me think. But even when I change, you know, if I have a violent thought, or if I have a very inappropriate joke that's suddenly sitting in my head, it is a change in my frequency. It is probably a change in my muscle tone. And anyway, I just think this is very, very difficult, actually. I think that we're in an era where it is very difficult to actually form real connection. And so there is a real value in containers, such as the net, for example, or, yeah, like Jacob mentioned, that we just had this retreat in the UK. It was a men's retreat, right? So there was a certain experience of there's only men here, so that actually simplifies something in the frequency. But it's also very necessary to go into those unknown situations where I might well offend someone before I even realize it. And try to practice all of this in those kinds of spaces as well. So I'll leave it there.
No, magnificent. And I think what you're describing about this pulling apart of differences, the seeing of different frequencies, all of that, I would associate that all with what Aspasia was getting at. You cannot do that by rushing into action. It actually is going to require more of the gestation, of a kind of holding the tension, because those kind of differences or those different frequencies or things like that, or you rushing into action, those things have to be unveiled to you in a certain way. Right? Like they have to be unveiled to you. And when you rush into action, you close the probability curve of what can be unveiled to you to the determination of your action that you've chosen. So then if you're in a world, an increasingly a world that is increasingly complex, complexity basically, if I use the Harold Malwich kind of idea, complexity is that which you cannot think. Like complexity is that which you cannot think. The complicated can be thought, but the complex is that which more actually has to be shown to you. Now, notice I did not say you cannot think it, but that doesn't mean it cannot be intelligible to once it manifests to you. It's more like complexity is that which you would not sit down and like rationally, intentionally engineer. But it can mysteriously pop in your head as you're writing a story. It can surprise you in the sacred romance. Like complexity has a way that its distinctions and terrain and caricature, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber here, has to be something you come upon, right? But you see, if you're rushing into action, you don't come upon things. And I guess what I wanted to also say, I think it was when Luber was speaking, on this choosing activity, which I think goes into the meadow and the tree thing as well. So there's a weird way in which to go back, when you're angry and you just want to act, it looks like agency, but I would actually argue you're not developing agency. There's a weird way where action can reduce agency. We tend to think that action increases agency, but actually if you feel anger and you just act on it, you have to pause to create agency and then choose the action. But if you just do, what ends up happening is as soon as you act, you actually cease creating the space where agency can be developed. And we tend to get it completely opposite because we think you only have agency to the degree you act. That's why we rush into action in the way Aspasia was warning against. But actually the suspension of action and holding with the tension, that develops agency because you're able to pause. If you can't pause, you don't have agency. You're just determinism, cause and effect, anger, act, anger, act. If you want there to be freedom in tension, then you have to be able to pause and sit with the tension. And basically, complexity can only manifest to you in its difference from freedom, which is pause. And also to the reason why you do conversations like this or so forth, like the phrase you were saying, all bodies in the room are part of the nervous system. I've never thought of that. I've never heard of that. That's surprising to me. Wow. So you have something that then you hear, framework, that then changes how you can act in a space. And had you never heard that phrase, then you would have never gotten that option of how to act in a space. And maybe you use it once in your life or 10 times in your life or so forth. But these phrases that surprise you, and this just applies to all things, new perceptions was another phrase you had, right? To the degree you're able to live in such a manner where new perceptions can occur, surprising phrases or different things, is to the degree you're actually living in a manner that is complex, quote unquote, and thus aligned with the complexity of the world that comes with global pluralism and so on. And I would also argue that complexity is also requires virtue to hold and is the alignment, and it affords the possibility of resonance toward the beautiful. So I think also, and yes, the last thing gets into the judgment of joy, which is an extremely important topic. Joy, and if I put it this way, joy in a system, to the degree there is either joy or devastation in a system, is to the degree there can be real existential change. And if you have a flat system with no existential change, there's not going to be any dimensionality. It will be a meadow without any growth. It will just be a wasteland. Like joy, when people encounter joy, they either change or want to destroy it. And it puts an existential demand on them. And usually when people encounter joy, they want to do what Aspasia is warning again and act and kill it because it makes them feel judgment, versus sit with it and actually then say, well, maybe this is possible in life, right? Without the ability to wait in the way Aspasia was saying, you will destroy joy. You're going to destroy it because joy demands you become beautiful, that you must change your life, as Jockin has emphasized in the class. Joy will not settle with mediocrity, and you will not like that. because no one likes feeling joy, no judged. Which actually, the truth is, no one actually likes experiencing joy on the inside. No one actually enjoys the initial experience of you must change your life. No one likes that. No one likes encountering joy because it means you can do better. You can do more. F you. You don't know how hard my life is. You don't know what my upbringing was. You don't know what I've gone through. How dare you? Said you're joy. You're delusional. You haven't had it as hard as I have. That's why you're joyful. You haven't been through what I have. We dismiss it as quickly as possible. We act and thus acted away. And then we're enclosed in a world where we do not have joy because we're right. And being right is quite a threat to experiencing joy. So the judgment of joy, which I do think requires beauty, if you have a system, a social that lacks joy, there will not be existential change. And eventually everyone will be habituated into the mediocre, the hollow men of T.S. Eliot, that is the 9 to 5, and the system will stagnate. So the presence of joy allows the presence of complexity because it puts an existential demand on people, or a great leveling event, to use that term from William, which is a plague, a financial catastrophe, or a war. If we would like and I'll give it to Mr. Liberty, if we would like a world that existentially changes without World War III, we will require more joy in the system, which will require doing what Aspasia is saying, creating clearings for otherness, which means we also have to face the anxiety of the other person and rise to its occasion. If we cannot do that, then there cannot be agents of existential change in the system that will allow it to complexify, avoid equilibrium without shocks like Great Depressions and Great Wars. And that's really our moment at this potential transition from fourth to first turnings. Will it be changed by the judgment of joy? Or will it be changed by World War III? And we have to decide. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
Amazing. Okay, so I just want to clarify what I mean by active character real quick. So like from a storytelling standpoint, right? You being anger and then you're anxious and then you just do something, that does not mean that you're active. Like I understand like you are like instead of sitting there like a rock, you're like punching someone in the face. So I understand like why what I'm saying would make you think like I'm talking about active in that respect. I'm so like what I'm specifically talking about and whether it's a good or bad story, it's like when you are angry and it triggers anxiety, the question is what stakes are those is what that anxiety coupled with. And if the stakes, and then I know you have to go, so I'm going to try to. A lot of things that I'm about to say is very loaded, but I'm just going to say it like this because you have the time constraint here. Basically, how high the stakes are help determine whether it's a good story. So my whole point is if a character in a story is feeling angry because of some anxiety and it leads to some action and that action reveals something about the stakes and the stakes aren't high, that's not an active action then in the story, in terms of the story, in terms of its own unfolding. That's why like I push back. Like I agree with general heuristics about the relationship of emotions, but when you get into the particularities of a situation, into an unfolding, the focus to me is not on the relationship between the emotions, but the relationship between the emotion and those particular stakes and how whatever action is being done vis-a-vis external force that's related to the stakes, making you have to make a decision about, well, I agree anxiety is not an emotion. Like Heidegger would say anxiety is ontological. I'm just kind of sweepingly saying, like, I don't think that ultimately will negate my point. So like, I guess what I'm saying here is like, if you do an action in that situation and that action reveals something that's not really that revealing about the stakes, then it's not that active. Irregardless if it comes from anger, anxiety, whatever description you want to put on, whether that description has ontological roots or not, doesn't matter either. It's almost like a tangent to the point, because in storytelling, ontology is always going to be in respect to the particular unfolding. That's what's so key, and it's not outside of that particular unfolding. So like Heidegger just talking about anxiety being ontological in general, I even push back on because it's not even particularized enough in the way in which he's using it. He's just saying, generally speaking, this has to be the case. And I understand why he's saying that. But anyway, basically, it's like, here's my fear. If the stakes are fictional, then you're not really you can't possibly be doing something active. Like it has to have reality to it for you to care about it. Now, with that said, I think people care about fictional things more than real things, precisely because they turn their back, or they close the loop, like I was saying earlier. They're not curious enough about the situation to really understand the polysemantic quality of that situation. So like basically what an active character does is it reveals the polysemantic quality of the stakes of the situation. And if you aren't curious enough, you're essentially gonna not be an active character, and you'll have people like, I don't care, he's racist, I don't care, and that's it. That's like pretty boring. Like from a storytelling standpoint, if that is a heuristic that's like a real one, which I believe it is, and I know that's a take and that might not be true, but I think it's a real heuristic where people should judge things in terms of it being a good story. And if that's the case, it's like, you can't really say, oh, he's sexist, he's racist, any kind of bad thing like that. I don't know. You can't just write them off that way, because you're not going to enter that polysemantic world that's there. That, to me, is what makes the human being the human being. And like, if you cut off that world, you're gonna turn into a robot. Like that's basically like the what's at stake at play here. So it's like very interesting where, like, you know, like I've gone to plenty of therapy, for example, last year, and it's like my therapist at first was really like concerned about my emotions, and then as I just give him my response, what I noticed what would happen is it's like the conversation kind of just dies. It's like, okay, and that's it. But then when I like talk about the situation and the historicity that goes into the situation, and then I talk about the questions I have in that situation, then you relate all that, the history, the questions, with the feelings that I was expressing earlier, then there's a conversation. And it doesn't just stop in that one, meeting per se. So I think, with that being said, I'm on the side of shame has to be real, because the stakes have to really be there. There has to be real, or the shame, which is basically the destruction of that orientation. So that's my 2 cents, and then also just like not focusing on the emotions per se, but the emotions as they relate to the stakes of the unfolding.
Excellent. I'm going to jock in here, and the doom storm's here, so we'll see how long I last. I think that's all I think what's, there's a way in which we're really kind of messed up, in the sense that we think, like, I think a lot of people think the stakes are the emotions. Like, do I feel anger or not? Oh, I feel anger, therefore I failed, I'm a bad person, like we've talked about with Aspasia, right? When really the anger should be, the emotion should lead to the situation, like you were saying, to think of all the possibilities. Like, I feel anger, so let's think about the situation, right? And the situation is where we find the stakes. And I think there's also something to be said about shame leading one on a journey of determining the situation, right? And that there's something, I guess, what I keep thinking about is reality
if shame, ontology is tied to invitation to journey. Like something is real to the degree it affords an invitation on a journey. It makes possible a journey. It like invites you into something. There's something about reality being invitational. Now I know Mr. Jockin here had a fantastic talk with John Vervaeke, and I enjoyed very much what Vervaeke was saying about reality and intelligibility going together. Like something is real if it affords intelligibility, as I understood what he was saying. And there's something about beauty that is realist real because it actually gives rise to greater intelligibility. And I'm also increasingly interested in this question of beauty, truth, and goodness being equal, beauty over them, the primacy of beauty, and what are the stakes of that conversation? Like, let's say it's an emphasis discussion. Are there stakes to the emphasis? Like, what actually do you unfold differently as a person relative to which of those three you emphasize versus not? And I actually think that's a very real question. And then I also sometimes wonder, I guess the way sometimes it's like, in beauty, they're equal. It's almost like beauty is equal or greater than truth and goodness, where it's in beauty, there's an equality. But I've been thinking about that. And I've also been thinking about P equals MP. But there's something about intelligibility that correlates with reality. And since greater intelligibility seems as if it must be afforded by a journey, we need to treat our emotions, like everything, as leading us to something, like on a journey. Sacred romance, and obviously that gets tied to beauty. But let me pause and give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, good to see you this evening.
It's good to see everybody. I'm glad to be back. I think my main note on the shame guilt stuff, there's different ways to read it, but I think the big note, and to kind of be provocative about this same point, is that guilt, I never heard anyone killing themselves over guilt. Shame, people do kill themselves. And this was true classically. And also that's very important because that's even true classically. Because the whole point was, if you shamed yourself, the right action was to kill yourself. That was the move, falling your sword, all those aspects. So usually the shame guilt distinction is a modern classical distinction, but in the way I'm talking about it, again, the psychologists in the group and that therapist can point out to me where they've seen examples where guilt caused people to kill themselves. I don't see that. I've seen generally that guilt caused pressure to release the pressure, right? So maybe in that way they're similar in that sense. You could talk through it that way. But to that magnitude of, and I think I saw Aspasia put in the chat, shame absolutely renders you away, like you're cast away from the social order. That's what shame does. So I think that's just a note of thinking about how, when we talk about the stakes of shame, that's the magnitude of the aspect of it. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. I'll just close on that point.
No, that's outstanding. There is something about shame that almost has no hope of escape. Whereas with guilt, I can keep it quiet, or if nobody finds out. And of course, this is what Dostoevsky is exploring in Crime and Punishment. Is that even possible? But then, of course, there's a release. And it is interesting that guilt feels, that's a very good point. There is something about guilt that feels like if I confess, there's a chance of a release. It's interesting. You don't think about confessing shame, do you? Like, I don't confess shame. I confess guilt. It's like, you don't have to confess shame so much because everyone knows it. Like it's almost public, and there's a certain inescapability to it that then contributes to suicide. That's very, very interesting. And it feels as if you cannot bear to come back into relationality. And I do think the judgment of joy and shame go together, because there's something about rejecting that then can create shame. That's very, very interesting. But let me run before I lose internet under the conditions, and let's see if we can unfold the chairs today. But thank you all for coming. It is always a true joy to see you all and to speak with you. So thank you for making the time. And I highly suggest the Friends of the Beautiful. Those have been wonderful discussions. Daniel, thank you for being here. Seth. And we will see if we can successfully, always a treat. Best to you now.